So this is the lecture for part 2 of Whitehead's Process and Reality. Whitehead titles this part Discussions and Applications. So he's going to take the categories and the principles that he articulated in part 1, and he's going to apply them. He's going to enter them into a discussion with contemporary physics and biology, and also human experience generally. And he's going to see how they help elucidate what we know from science, what we know from human religion, religious experience, what we know from human artistic and literary experience, what we know from human moral experience, right? The whole gamut of human existence and consciousness and awareness and civilized life, the complex texture of civilized life, right? This is the data that Whitehead wants to examine and interpret in the terms of the categories, the categorical scheme that he has laid out in part 1. So there are 4 chapters, there are 10 chapters in this second part of Process and Reality. In this lecture, I'm going to cover the first 4 chapters, and those chapters are Chapter 1, titled Fact and Form, Chapter 2, titled The Extensive Continuum, Chapter 3, which is titled The Order of Nature, and Chapter 4, which is titled Organisms and Environment. Now, chapters 5 through 10 I will cover in a second lecture that covers the second half of this second part of Process and Reality. So, let's dive right in. In the first chapter, Fact and Form, Whitehead tells us that philosophy, all philosophy, his, Descartes, Locke's, Kant's, they must make some appeal to the facts. But the problem for philosophy in trying to appeal to the facts is that the facts are recorded in linguistic form that's scattered across all the special sciences, across literature, religion, and these scattered facts in linguistic form, they come already stamped with schemes of thought, right? So there are no uninterpreted facts waiting out there for philosophers to think about. We inherit a tradition of interpretation of facts, right? And we can try to say, like say Descartes did, that we can doubt the whole history of philosophy, all the tradition of religion. We can doubt even our own embodied experience, our own sensory perception of the world around us, and we can arrive at the mere fact that we are thinking, that we are doubting. This is the Cartesian method, right? A sort of absolute skepticism of everything, but at least what Descartes believes is this foundation, his own capacity to doubt and to know that he is doubting because of his own thinking capacity. For Descartes, this is the rock bottom, this is the bedrock foundation for all truth, for all philosophy, for all science, and all religion. And so, instead of doing that, what Whitehead is telling us is that he wants to inherit positively from the tradition of philosophy. He wants to get back in touch with his bodily feelings. He wants to bring the feelings of the viscera, he says, back into philosophical importance, rather than just visual perception and clear and distinct ideas, which most of the philosophers in the tradition have wanted to focus on. This tradition has ignored, Whitehead tells us, the feelings of the viscera, the bodily feelings of inheritance, right, that he's trying to elucidate for us with his new categories of prehension and concrescence and causal efficacy, his understanding of causation as a kind of inheritance of the feelings of the past, the perished feelings of the past, such that they are given new life in the present moment of each actual occasion of our experience. So Whitehead is, he says, positively inheriting the tradition of philosophy. He says that all of European philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And when he refers to Plato in this way, he's not talking about a Platonic system, right? Maybe Plotinus had a systematic understanding, of the universe and was inheriting some of Plato's insights. But for Whitehead, Plato wasn't a systematic thinker like Plotinus or like Aristotle, say. Plato was rather a visionary, and there's a wealth of general ideas in his dialogues. There's an inexhaustible mine of suggestion, like a gold mine of suggestion in Plato's dialogues. Whitehead, like Emerson before him, would say that Plato not only came up with all the general ideas that philosophers continue to debate today, he came up with all the best criticisms of those ideas as well. So it's a wealth of general ideas. It's a mine of inexhaustible suggestion. And Whitehead admits that his philosophy of organism is really just a modern rendering of Plato's general point of view, especially in the dialogue de Timaeus, which is Plato's cosmological dialogue. Of course, Whitehead's going to update Plato's politics a bit, his aesthetics. He has to update science and also religion. There's been an evolution, cultural evolution of all of these things, so we can't just adopt all of Plato's views. But again, the general ideas Whitehead thinks are extremely valuable, and we really can't do better than Plato did. So in this first chapter on fact and form, Whitehead's going to try to discuss the givenness of fact, what Plato called the necessity of fact, with the potentiality of form that inhabits fact, that structures fact, that gives fact some order. These are Plato's ideas, right? And Whitehead, again, inheriting Plato, inherits the theory of forms or ideas, but with important amendments, right? He's a process philosopher. He's not a thinker of static, eternal forms. So how does form, eternal form, participate in temporal fact? That's Whitehead's topic for this chapter. And so throughout this chapter, he'll talk about the nature of an actual occasion, its dipolarity with different phases, a subject phase and an object phase, or a superject phase is this term that Whitehead coins. So let's briefly go through this. Whitehead tells us that the function of God in the world is to mediate between temporal actuality and eternal potential, right? God mediates between actuality and eternality by securing for each actual occasion of experience some sense of relevant novelty, because God's a creature of creativity, just like all the other finite actual entities or actual occasions in the universe. But God provides the ground of value and order and aim for all other actual occasions of experience. So all other actual occasions of experience are inheriting God's initial way of valuing the realm of potential. And by valuing that realm of potential, God gives it some tilt, some direction, some hierarchy of value, so that there is a trajectory to becoming. God provides an initial aim, Whitehead tells us, to every actual occasion of experience, so that as it emerges out of potentiality, which is both the pure potentiality of creativity itself, but also the real potentiality, Whitehead's technical phrase here, real potentiality of the past. So God doesn't have a past. God's primordial. All other actual occasions have a past. They inherit that past. All the other actual occasions have made decisions in the past universe. And in each moment we inherit those decisions. We inherit the decisions of protons and electrons to form the type of atomic relationships that they have. We inherit the decisions of atoms to form into stars, and stars to form into galaxies. And in a materialistic, scientific materialist cosmology, we're not used to thinking of decisions taking place at that physical level of organization. We reserve decision for conscious, rational human beings. Whitehead's exploding that picture, wide open, right? And when he talks about decision, he's talking about a limitation amidst possibility. And creativity is infinite possibility, infinite potential. God, as the primordial creature of that creativity, conditions that creativity, limits it, gives it some definite tilt, as I said. And the atomists like Democritus had their tilt. It was called the clinamen, or the swerve, right? The atoms fall through the void, but there's a swerve. It starts to spin them a little bit, and out of that just initial spin, order can emerge over the course of time. So Whitehead's notion of the primordial nature of God, giving each actual occasion an initial aim, it's his version of the swerve. It's his version of the clinamen, as the ancient Greek atomists referred to it. So God mediates between actuality and potentiality by giving each actual occasion a sense of what is relevant to it, what possibilities, what eternal objects are relevant to it for the interpretation of its experience from its unique perspective in space-time. Every actual occasion, Whitehead tells us, and he gets into this in chapter 2 on the extensive continuum, every actual occasion brings forth and houses the universe within itself. So every actual occasion is another novel perspective on the universe, another new way in which the real potentiality of the past world is reborn in the present and clothed with new emotion, clothed with new perspective. And certainly the lower grade forms of actual occasions that comprise what we call the physical world of atoms and stars and galaxies and so on. Certainly their decisions are not as, they're not conscious. First of all, Whitehead says not all experience is conscious experience. So the experience of these lower grade actual occasions includes, they're lower because they're less capable of deciding among possibilities foreign to the actual situation in which they find themselves. For the most part, what we call physical and also chemical occasions of experience and societies of occasions, as Whitehead's going to elaborate on his notion of a society in this second part of Process and Reality as well. At this physical and chemical level, they're mostly repetitive. They inherit the past and experience it in the present in much the same way that it occurred in the past. There's very little conceptual or mental origination. The decision is almost always, in the case of these physical occasions, the decision is almost always to repeat what just happened, right? That's why physics can get along so well with mechanistic models of the physical world, because the physical world is very repetitive. But as the societies of actual occasions that constitute the evolution of the universe, and Whitehead describes these various levels of social organization of actual occasions, from the physical to the chemical, to the biological, to the animal, to the human. These are different levels of complexity of social organization of actual occasions of experience, as Whitehead describes them. And as we move through this evolutionary adventure, occasions of experience become sheltered within structured societies. And in the case of living societies, like single cells and plants and animals and human organisms, the sheltering functions as what Whitehead calls a kind of complex amplifier, so that the organism, the physiology of a structured society like a living organism, it's amplifying the important features of the surrounding environment and sheltering a stream of entirely living occasions of experience. And Whitehead says they're not social. He says it's a nexus, which is a more general form of relationship among actual occasions, without social order, because Whitehead thinks that life implies a form of mentality or conceptual originality or freedom that can't be, strictly speaking, socially ordered, because societies are, again, generally reiterative of the forms of the past. And what's special about life is its originality. Life is a bid for freedom, Whitehead tells us. So it inhabits what Whitehead calls the interstices of the brain, where through the sheltering and the filtering and the amplification provided by the structured organization, the complex organization of the living body, there are occasions of experience that Whitehead says wander through the interstices of the brain and the interstices of each cell. And in these occasions of experience, there is a form of inheritance still and of reproduction and memory, but it's guided by a sort of mentality that is unlike anything we've really seen before, at least expressed in the physical world, right? Atoms have the germ of mentality, Whitehead tells us. That's why any novelty is possible. That's why there's a swerve, because there's a gravitational gradient. Hydrogen atoms want to congeal, want to move towards one another. And that desire, expressed as gravity, what physicists call gravity, is the germ of mentality in the physical world. But this germ, it evolves, it intensifies once you get to cellular, organic, biological life as it exists on planet Earth and perhaps many other planets. The germ of mentality becomes a fully expressed capacity to respond creatively to a changing environment, right? So I've jumped ahead here, obviously, into later chapters in this part by talking about living societies of actual occasions. I want to just go back for a moment to talk about some more basic categories like prehension and actual occasions, because this is what Whitehead's universe is built out of. And he tells us that as far as God is concerned, these more complex social organizations they're kind of incidental to the process of creative advance. What God's interested in is intensity of subjective experience, which is always in actual occasions. Societies are only important to God because they help shelter more intense subjective experience in individual actual occasions. So Whitehead's God is not concerned with preserving certain species of life, with preserving certain forms of order in the universe. No. Preservation may be a side effect of God's real aim, which is for intensity of experience, right? You need to survive to have experience, but there are forms of survival that are much more efficient, like, say, being a rock. A rock has tremendous survival capacity, millions and millions of years, right? Whereas more sensitive living organisms may live only a few decades, but they're more sensitive. They're realizing God's aim, which is more intense subjective experience. And for Whitehead, subjective experience is a process, right? It has phases. And as I said, it's dipolar in nature, such that it begins as this process of inheritance of the past into subjective immediacy. And there's a subjective aim that's guiding this process of concrescence. And it's moving towards definiteness. It's moving towards what Whitehead calls satisfaction. And as this subjective aim inherits its past, gives its own emotional or subjective form to that past, it's ingressing what Whitehead calls eternal objects, which Whitehead says any entity whose conceptual recognition does not involve a necessary reference to any definite actual entities of the temporal world is an eternal object. So, for example, numbers are a great example. They're very easy to illustrate. The number 2 is not present in any two particular objects or entities that we might use to exemplify it, right? So I could hold up two identical pencils. Or I could hold up a pencil and a marker. Or I could hold up a pencil and a leaf. Or a pencil and a pillow. And these two things really have nothing in common other than that they are things, and that they exemplify the essence of two, or they are examples of two-ness, right? And we see this eternal form of two-ness present in very different sets of particular objects. So this is Whitehead's point, that any entity whose conceptual recognition does not involve a necessary reference to any definite actual entities in the temporal world, that's what an eternal object is. But they're more than just numbers for Whitehead. They're also qualities, sensory qualities. And they're also complex emotions. So colors and sounds. But a whole song, a whole musical score is itself a complex eternal object. And it's made up of simpler eternal objects. So you can analyze a complex eternal object into its component parts, right? So a stop sign has the eternal object of an octagon, the eternal object red, eternal objects S, T, O, and P, and so on. And you can break these down to their simplest form, which Whitehead just calls sensa. The most simple eternal objects Whitehead calls sensa, right? So these eternal objects ingress into the experience of every concressing actual occasion, and they allow us to revivify the objectified past, the perished past, to revivify it, to bring it back to life. And often we're inheriting the eternal objects that those past occasions ingressed and experienced. But there's also, in each concrescence, an originative phase or a conceptual phase or a mental pole, right? So if the physical pole is the inheritance of the objectified past, including the eternal objects that those past occasions experienced, then the mental pole is the introduction of novel eternal objects, which allows for new interpretations of that past and more complex actual occasions of experience, right, that are sheltered by structured societies. They might even be part of living societies. They're able to introduce more novelty. They're able to dip into the field of potential or the realm of eternal objects more deeply, to ingress more novelty in their interpretations of the past that they're inheriting. Now, there's a givenness to this past that can't be changed. And, Whitehead wants to justify some notion of causality. And so every actual occasion is stuck with its past, right? You can't ignore everything that you inherit. Even a human being, with all of the freedom sheltered for us by the complex brain and nervous system, with all the freedom that it affords the stream of actual occasions that is the living person, the living soul that we are. Even we have trauma, ancestral trauma, that, even I think Whitehead would say maybe there are enlightened men and women, there are Buddhas, there are gurus, but it's not like they've just forgotten their traumatic childhood. It's not like they've just forgotten the cultural inheritance of their people, wiped the slate clean. There is no blank slate, right? Every actual occasion, even a free human being, must inherit their past. But there's a way, and Whitehead refers to this in part one as a categorical obligation, which he calls our ability for conceptual reversion, I believe, where the subjective aim of each new concressing experience and the secondary phases of its concressence, it can diverge from what its physical inheritance is, what its inheritance of the past is. There's a conceptual reversion or a divergence from the inheritance by giving it a new interpretation, right? So we can do this, and it's a tension for Whitehead. It's a balance, right? So this is the process of concrescence in its dipolarity. It inherits a past, it interprets it in the present, and then as soon as it reaches its satisfaction, as soon as its subjective aim attains at least the best, in the best way that it can, to the extent that it is capable, when it attains its end, it reaches its ideal harmonization, then it perishes. It moves from subjectivity or subjective immediacy to objective immortality. It becomes, from a subject, it becomes a superject, Whitehead says. And a superject is an object inherited by the next round of concrescence. So this is the subject, superject, dipolar process of concrescence, right? Unlike for Descartes, where there's two separate worlds, the subjective world of thinking subjects and the objective world of extended nature, for Whitehead, subjects and objects are part of the same process. They're ways of describing something in an abstract way that concretely he thinks is a process, right? And Descartes' way of describing this process was too abstract. It broke the process. It freeze-dried the process into static substances. And, Whitehead's trying to provide us with categories that are more attentive to our actual embodied experience. So, Whitehead tells us that the human being is that form of actuality whose immediate experience is the most completely open to us. So we do need to start metaphysics with human experience and attempt to generalize from our experience to the experience of atoms, the experience of electrons. That's Whitehead's project. And a lot of people dismiss his project out of hand for this reason, because they think it's anthropomorphic, that we're reading into these physical processes our own human conscious mentality. And, Whitehead will say, look, he says it's a sound doctrine of physical science, right? That what happens inside of our bodies is the same, it obeys the same laws as what happens outside of our bodies in the larger universe. But he says that this sound doctrine is double-edged, because the converse also applies, which is that what happens within the human body, the living organization and living process and living experience that we know firsthand, that this must also be understood to be generalizable to the rest of what's happening in the rest of the universe, right? So Whitehead looks at this both ways. Yes, we want the laws of nature to apply everywhere. We want the patterns of behavior that apply to planets orbiting the sun to apply to molecules vibrating inside of living cells. But we want what happens inside living cells to also apply to what's happening at the level of the solar system and the galaxy. It's all one universe. So Whitehead's seeking a more coherent explanation for this oneness of all the processes in the universe than that which mechanistic materialism gave us, or that which idealistic rationalism gave us. He wants to give us a more coherent scheme. So Whitehead is thinking with some very important early modern philosophers, right? David Hume, John Locke, René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Gottfried Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, and Georg Hegel, among others. But these are the primary interlocutors that Whitehead is engaging with. If you haven't read these thinkers firsthand, or if you haven't read a good history of philosophy that tells you a little bit about the conversation they were all having with each other, then a lot of what Whitehead's saying isn't going to make much sense to you. Hopefully you've at least read Richard Tarnas's Passion of the Western Mind, particularly the parts on early modern philosophy and Kant and what Kant was reacting to, trying to synthesize the British empiricists and the rationalists into a transcendental philosophy, so-called. If you don't know anything about this portion of the history of philosophy, understanding why it is going to be even more difficult than it otherwise would be if you had read them. So yeah, at least check out the sections on modern philosophy in Richard Tarnas's book, Passion of the Western Mind. I also have a series of lectures that I use in my course on German idealism that might be helpful for you to grasp this moment in the history of philosophy, because Whitehead's really responding to Plato and Aristotle and to the early modern philosophers. So it's important to be conversant with all of these thinkers to really grasp the significance of what Whitehead is doing. Now, he's positively inheriting a lot of the scattered insights of Locke and Descartes, and he's rejecting the attempt to systematize a philosophy of either rationalism or empiricism, because he thinks that this attempt to systematize does violence to our actual experience. And one of the ways that he rejects these early modern thinkers is by rejecting the representational theory of perception, which, its best formulation is René Descartes, who says that there's a mind, a thinking substance, and an extended world out there, and that somehow the mind is able to know that world, is able to know nature by internally representing nature in its own mental terms, right? So what we finally have access to for Descartes and for all the other early modern thinkers, really, is mere thoughts or sense impressions, right? We have no access to the world out there. We only experience our own thoughts. This is the representational theory of perception, and it's created all sorts of problems for philosophy and for cognitive science and epistemology. Up to this day, there's still a representationalist residue in contemporary philosophy's attempt to understand how cognition functions. And Whitehead is really critical of this way of thinking. He's critical of it because he says these representationalist thinkers like Descartes and Kant, they degrade the world into mere appearance, right? And Whitehead says, we do not find ourselves in a world of solitary substances, each enjoying an illusory private experience, right? Rather, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures. This is Whitehead's organic realism. He's not an idealist. He's not a skeptic. But nor is he, saying that we have to totally throw out Descartes' point of view. Again, he's looking to Descartes. He's looking to David Hume. He's looking to Kant for certain insights that they express that they then forget about and they don't include in their system because it contradicts that system. And Whitehead's saying, let's keep our system open. We can still be systematic, but let us not do violence to our experience with this overly abstract theory of representation. Let us rather return to our experience, return to our perception, and see if we can't describe it more adequately in terms of, Whitehead's categories of prehension, right, and the phases of concrescence. So Whitehead says he'd go back and rewrite Locke's essay concerning human understanding as an essay concerning experience in general, not just human understanding or human experience or human consciousness, but experience as such that goes beyond the human, that makes human consciousness possible. Whitehead also tells us he wants to rewrite Kant, the critique of pure reason, as a critique of pure feeling, right? So he's engaging with these early modern thinkers and trying to amend them to say, yeah, you should have paid more attention to this rather than to that. You should have paid more attention to the feelings of bodily inheritance of the just past world, rather than to these clear and distinct ideas and abstract reflections upon your experience. One of the most brilliant things that Whitehead does in engaging with these early modern thinkers is look at David Hume and also in Descartes at the phenomenological descriptions of experience that they have, where they admit to these feelings of inheritance in their bodies of the just prior moment. And while Hume will explicitly deny that there's any evidence for causality in our sensory experience, in the very sentence in which he is denying that, he is tacitly presupposing that we see with our eyes, that we touch with our hands, that we hear with our ears. So he's presupposing this kind of bodily causality, right? That there is a transmission of feeling from the retina through the optic nerve into the brain, where there is some final percipient, Whitehead calls it, that will then feel what the retina has felt, right? Because the body, again, is this complex amplifier of the environment, right? So even in David Hume, even in René Descartes, who's doubting all of his bodily sensory experience, and Hume who is denying causality in our experience, they're tacitly presupposing it. And Whitehead's trying to highlight this as evidence for his own point of view. So in the place of this representational theory of perception and of knowledge, Whitehead puts his prehensional theory of perception. And prehension is the process whereby the activity of the world around us, of the environment, is inherited by and enters into the activity constituting our own immediately felt subjective experience. So causality is the inheritance of feeling from the environment into the body, and we directly experience it. The world enters into us. Our experience is made out of the objectified past, right? Experience has this dipolar nature. It arises and perishes. Each of our moments of experience arises out of a perished past, inherits that past. It's part of us. That's what causality is, right? And this really allows us to understand the relationship between the mind and the body in a completely novel way, not available to us in any of these modern thinkers, whether it's David Hume or René Descartes or Immanuel Kant. Whitehead is revolutionizing the picture, the understanding of how the mind relates to the world. So let's take a look to see what Whitehead does to one of Descartes' most famous philosophical articulations, right? This notion of the cogito, of the I think, and this deduction that because I think, I am, right? I think, therefore I am. Whitehead reads this statement of Descartes, and he says each time that Descartes pronounces it, the he that thinks, the I that thinks, is different, right? The he that is common in each instance, in Whitehead's terms, is an eternal object. Or we could also describe it as a nexus of successive occasions, right? Of a living person, in Whitehead's terms. I am, I exist. Each time he pronounces this, Descartes is a different I, right? Whitehead tells us no thinker thinks twice. So rather than there being a mental substance, right, that endures through time, unchanging, that is the I doing the thinking, Whitehead is saying that the thinking is a process that is constantly self-differentiating, that's arising and perishing. Inheriting, a new occasion would then inherit, arise, and perish. So that our thinking is just like what's happening out there in the natural world. There's this dipolar process of concrescence, this sort of creative pulsation, right, of immediate subjectivity, perishing into objective immortality, taken up again in the next moment of subjective immediacy, perishing into objective immortality, a process of subjectivity moving to superjectivity. Right? This is Whitehead's rereading of Descartes. So that we can talk about ourselves as a thinking substance, so long as what we mean by substance is this self-differentiating process. And the self-differentiating process that's going on in our own immediate, most intimate lived experience is going on in the hydrogen atoms that compose the sun, right? It's going on in the molecules composing the crystals that are forming in the bowels of the earth. It's going on uh, throughout the physical universe, this process of pulsation, of creativity and inheritance and creative advance. So what we feel inside of our own most intimate experience, sheltered by the complex organization of our body, Whitehead says this does give us insight into the world in general, into physical process, physical activity as such, right? So whereas the ancient Hermetic uh, philosophers would say as above, so below, Whitehead says as within, so without. So a lot of people, when they hear about Whitehead and how he is a pan-experientialist or a pan-psychist who thinks that there are decisions occurring out there in the physical world, that atoms are making decisions, they say, they dismiss it by saying, oh, he thinks rocks can think, right? So people are always throwing rocks at Whitehead. The same argument was used against Bishop Berkeley, whose idealism was rather extreme. He thought that all that really exists are ideas in our minds or perceptions, and that God is what's finally real. He said to be is to be perceived. And right, one of the rebuttals was um, performed by kicking a rock and saying, I refute thusly your theory, Bishop Berkeley. And, Whitehead's not an idealist like Berkeley, but people are still throwing rocks at him. And he spends several pages in this part of Process and Reality talking about what he calls the quiet, extensive stone, and his understanding of the process of reality as a process of self-differentiation, of creative pulsation. He tries to show how our understanding of mere material stuff mutely enduring and inhabiting space, how abstract it is, and how in fact a stone, physical science has told us that a stone is actually composed of a society of separate molecules in violent agitation, right? So what is a stone really? It's not just mere stuff sitting there, right? It's a vibratory activity, and somehow it maintains its form as a stone as we perceive it, right? And so Whitehead's whole account of how societies inherit an order throughout all their members, all the actual occasions composing them. Even a molecule within the stone is itself a society of actual occasions, right? And even the atoms composing the molecules and the subatomic particles composing the atoms. These are processes of activity. They are vibrations of energy according to physics, right? There is no mere stuff that just inhabits empty space in this mute or quiet, extensive way, as Whitehead puts it. So, when Whitehead's talking about pan-experientialism, he's not saying stones can think. He's saying that stones aren't what you think they are. And he's saying that, what Descartes thought thinking was, is this sort of private, internal process of representation. It's actually not that at all. There is a moment of subjective immediacy that we might want to call private, but it perishes as soon as it satisfies itself and attains an experiential perspective on the world. It perishes and becomes public. And indeed, the next moment of experience inherits these public facts, which are perished experiences from the past. So what is private in one moment perishes and becomes public in the next. It's published, you might say. The private thoughts of every thinker are published into the world, inherited by the next moment. So, Whitehead's saying to those who would throw stones at him that this metaphysical doctrine of undifferentiated endurance is baseless. It's metaphysically baseless. So a stone is not just mere stuff inertly sitting there, right? And thinking is not just this pure, completely non-physical magic. Thinking is what actual occasions of experience become capable of when they're sheltered by certain high-grade living societies, like our bodies. But it's the same fundamental activity of creative pulsation that's going on within the stone, and that science describes this as the vibratory activity of the molecules and the atoms, and the quantum events. So, Whitehead's pan-experientialism follows from this shift in physics toward an event ontology, away from an ontology of substantial particles to an ontology of interrelated events. And so for Whitehead, when we think in terms of events or in terms of occasions, we're thinking in more experiential terms. We're thinking of processes of inheritance of a past and anticipation of a future. And maybe when we're talking about molecules and atoms, there's very little anticipation and it's mostly just inheritance, the reiteration of the past, the reproduction of the past in what can seem like a very mechanical way. But there's still the germ of mentality there, which is this capacity for anticipation. And that capacity is enhanced and intensified as the social organization that shelters and houses occasions of experience grows more complex through an evolutionary process, right? So what's going on in the stones is analogous to what's going on in the brain, right? It's a process of creative inheritance and anticipation. That's what experience means for Whitehead. That's what decision means for Whitehead, right? So the process of concrescence, it's not just a description of human experience. Whitehead wants to generalize the most fundamental and generic features of our experience, of consciousness as human beings. He wants to generalize that so that it can apply even to what's going on in a stone, so that the same categories can be used to understand the apparent endurance of a stone through time as can be used to understand the stream of our conscious experience. It's quite a feat to try to pull that off, to come up with a scheme of ideas general enough to adequately account for the existence of a stone and the existence of a thinking, conscious mind, right? But that's what Whitehead's attempting. So in the second part of Process and Reality, Whitehead introduces us to what he calls the extensive continuum. Now, he'll return to this in part 4 of Process and Reality and elaborate upon it at length. It's one of the more difficult concepts to grok in Whitehead, and when I say it's one of the more difficult concepts in an already difficult book, I think that really might frighten you. I know you're going to have questions about this. I have questions about it, but I've assigned us some reading from Randall Auxier and Gary Herstein's book, The Quantum of Explanation, which really highlights the significance and the importance of Whitehead's theory of extension and the extensive continuum, because it's a thread that runs through Whitehead's entire career, going back to his work as a mathematician in the late 1890s and the first decade or two of the 1900s. Whitehead develops an understanding of extension that is pushing the boundaries that's at the leading edges of geometrical speculation, right? And he's eventually, Whitehead, developing what has come to be called projective geometry and topology in this field of study called Mario topology, which is it's a study of the relationship between wholes and parts, the most general things we can say about such relationships. It's a very significant through line that connects all of Whitehead's thought all the way to his late speculative philosophical and cosmological work. So when Whitehead talks about an extensive continuum, he's talking about a field of potentiality. He says it's that general relational element in experience whereby the actual entities experienced and that unit experience itself are united in the solidarity of one common world, right? So he says actual entities, actual occasions atomize the extensive continuum, and they thereby make real or actual what was antecedently merely potential, right? So the extensive continuum is a field of potentiality. Now, this is different from other early modern thinkers like Newton and Descartes' attempts to deal with extension or space, we might say, though for Whitehead, his theory of extension is an attempt to describe something more general than what we call space and what we call time. Actual occasions, in their atomization of the extensive continuum, in making actual the potential field of relationship, they're temporalizing and spatializing this extensive continuum, right? So it's more general than spatial and temporal relations. And Whitehead says this extensive continuum expresses the solidarity of all possible standpoints in the world process. So, he talks about how each actual occasion, in a sense, it brings forth its own world, right? He's a pluralist in the sense that when we ask what the world is made of, well, it's made of perspectives. But it's not just a jumbled chaos of different perspectives that have nothing to do with one another, right? All of the perspectives brought forth in these actual occasions of experience are coordinated within this field of potentiality that has mathematical patterns that are like woven into it. Actual occasions arise within this field of potential, and it's what allows them to relate to one another and share some sense of commonality. But whereas Newton thought that extension was actual, and Descartes thought it was actual, they both thought it was actual in different ways. Newton thought it was just a void, that nothing, emptiness, actually existed in some way, right? Descartes thought that it was a plenum, that space or extension is not just empty, it's not a vacuum. Descartes thought nature abhors a vacuum, right? He inherits Aristotle's thought on this. And so instead, for Descartes, space is full of these very fine, like material particles that there's no space between them, right? They just rub up against each other, and the way that, say, gravitational potential can travel is by these particles pushing up against one another. For Newton, who had a notion of empty space, he had no idea what was allowing gravitational potential to propagate between massive objects in space, right? It was a kind of action at a distance, so-called. It's not that Descartes' theory didn't also have some issues. Whitehead's trying to revision this by saying extension is a field of potentiality. It's not something actual. It's abstract, right? And what's actual are these occasions of experience that bring forth a perspective, a particular perspective on the world, and that what the world process is a sort of accumulation of the achievement of these perspectives as they, they're cumulative in the sense that in each moment a new concrescence inherits an entire past and adds to it, right? The many become one and are increased by one. And that's what nature is this creative advance from perspective to perspective, always growing wider because it's inheriting all these past perspectives. This is different than Newton and Descartes' vision. They're not process thinkers. They're still thinking of space as something actually existing. Whitehead is saying that space is a field of potential relationships, right? So we'll continue to return to this notion of the extensive continuum throughout this course. So if you don't fully get it yet, don't worry. So in the chapter on the order of nature, Whitehead will talk about the way our cosmic epoch is structured by these layers of social organization, right? And that these layers come in more and more special forms, and that one way of trying to grok what he means by the extensive continuum is to think of those features of reality that are so general that they're even beyond our cosmic epoch, which is to say, to put it in contemporary physical cosmological terms, he would say that there's something about the nature of reality that is, we can understand it mathematically, that precedes even our Big Bang, our inflationary moment, right? Our cosmic epoch, in other words, is more special than and has properties and qualities that evolved over time that are based upon the mathematical structure of the extensive continuum, right? That build on that basic metaphysical structure. And Whitehead's not claiming that he's fully described this extensive continuum's character. He thinks that that is really difficult He's saying, here's a little bit of what we can say about it. We can know enough based on just the mathematical relations holding true of this extensive continuum to define straight lines, right? He can define a straight line without making reference to anything more specific than the nature of this extensive continuum. And he'll do this, he'll define straight lines for us topologically in part 4 of Process and Reality. But one way of visualizing this is, on page 98, Whitehead goes through the various layers constituting the reality that we inhabit in our cosmic epoch, right? And so the realm of extensive connection is around the outside here. That's the extensive continuum. More special than that is the geometrical society that characterizes what geometricians have figured out about how space is ordered in our cosmic epoch. Even more special than that is what he calls the electromagnetic society of actual occasions. And even more special than that is the atomic and molecular societies of actual occasions. And now we're talking about evolutionarily emergent forms of organization, right? More special than that, even, are the stars and the galaxies. And more special than that are the living societies of cells and simple protists and bacteria, plants and animals and human beings. Within living societies, we might also place what he calls living persons as an even more special form of social organization. And, we live in this series of enveloping forms of societal order. And when physics talks about the laws of nature, for Whitehead, these are not eternal, right? The only thing that's eternal are the very general mereotopological qualities of the extensive continuum. The laws of nature are evolutionarily emergent. They're more like habits. And for Whitehead, these emerge as electromagnetism, as the electromagnetic society of occasions organizes itself in the course of cosmic evolution. That's when you start to get these very highly regular habits, these highly habitual patterns of activity that characterize the electromagnetic field, gravitational attraction, the strong and weak nuclear forces, right? All these things that particle physicists describe. And then, when you get into molecular societies, you get the sorts of behaviors that chemists describe. And already there, you're starting to see more novelty enter into the picture, right? Ilya Prigogine, famous Belgian chemist, won a Nobel Prize for his work on far from equilibrium, far from thermodynamic equilibrium chemical systems that exhibit these irreversible creative dynamics, right? That's starting to verge on what we consider only living organisms to be capable of. But obviously, living organisms are these very far from thermodynamic equilibrium, right? Neg-entropic self-organizing systems. And these are just, in Whitehead's terms, more special forms of social organization. But the form of highly structured social organization exhibited in a living organism is dependent upon the social organization achieved at the levels of stars and galaxies, at the levels of atoms and molecules, and at the levels of electrons and photons. Right? There's a way in which these achievements at more general scales of social organization must happen in order to support and scaffold, and Whitehead says shelter, the more complex organization that happens within them. So in these first 4 chapters in part 2, Whitehead introduces his theory of perception, right, which is his alternative to the representational theory of perception. He describes perception in terms of 2 pure modes, the mode of presentational immediacy and the mode of causal efficacy. He says philosophy has tended to ignore perception in the mode of causal efficacy and to dwell almost entirely on the mode of presentational immediacy, which presentational immediacy, very briefly, is the sense of contemporary spatial shape and perspective from the percipient, from the perspective of the actual occasion in question, right? Perception in the mode of causal efficacy it's the objectification of the past by the present, the inheritance of perished past experience into the renewed subjective immediacy of the present. So causal efficacy is the transmission of feelings from the past into the present, right? Presentational immediacy is the sense of contemporary spatial shape and perspective. And Whitehead says these pure modes almost always, in our experience, they come mixed. And we call this mixed form of perception symbolic reference, right? It's where we're trying to link up our feeling of causal efficacy with our perceptions of presentational immediacy, so that when we hold the stone in our hand, we don't just see a gray color and feel pressure on our fingers and in our palm, but that we actually are able to inherit the actual existence of that enduring society of actual occasions called the stone, and know that it's real, right? Whitehead's alternative theory of perception is realist, whereas the representationalist theory of perception, it forces us into this sort of solipsistic view of reality as merely an appearance. Whitehead, one of my favorite lines from Whitehead's Process in Reality is where he characterizes his philosophy in opposition to the Kantian mode of philosophy. And Kant is inheriting Descartes, he's inheriting Hume. Whitehead writes that for Kant, the world emerges from the subject, whereas for the philosophy of organism, the subject emerges from the world. Right? So he's inverting this Kantian transcendental perspective. Right? So again, for Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is describing the process by which subjective data pass into the appearance of an objective world. All we get for Kant and for Descartes and for Hume is an apparent world. All of these modern philosophers are forcing us to question the existence of the external world, and Whitehead's saying, no, let's return to our experience, let's look again and feel again, and realize that we're in contact with reality. It's not merely an appearance, right? So Whitehead, instead, his philosophy of organism, it describes how objective data pass into subjective satisfaction. So the subject emerges from the world for Whitehead. It's not a world merely appearing to a subject, a conjectured world, right, as is the case for Kant. So Whitehead will return to unpack more of the details of his theory of perception in the remaining chapters of Part 2. For now, I'm going to wrap up this lecture. There's so much more to cover in these chapters, but we'll have to dig into that in our live discussion.